I wanted to attempt the world record ice bath and see how hard it really is. But first, there were a lot of things I had to train, and you'll be surprised how much average people are truly capable of. I decided this wasn't going to be as straightforward as just getting in an ice bath and seeing how long I could stay. I knew if I was going to try this, I had to do it right. So in order to do it to the best of my ability, I knew I had to spend a few days training. And right from the start, I gave myself a time limit of just 3 days. And I knew these next 3 days would be some of the most uncomfortable days of my life. But still, I wanted to go through this because I'm just an average person that wants to show what people are truly capable of. So with that being said, before day 1, it was time to see where I was at. Let's call this day 0, and I decided to take an ice bath to see how long I could last without any training whatsoever. This is really important because this will show how much I will have improved over the course of these 3 days. But I had to make sure that for this one, I would give it my all. I went to the store to get a dozen bags of ice so that I can fill up the bathtub and keep it cold at all times. I had to make sure that however long I stayed in there, I would have enough ice so that my body heat didn't melt at all. And I knew this would suck. It was going to be super uncomfortable, but I was really excited to see how long I would last. I started to fill up the bathtub, first with water, then all the ice. And as it got colder and colder, I realized what I was getting myself into. They say you shouldn't stay in an ice bath longer than 15 minutes. Without the proper training, it could be really dangerous, and you don't want to push yourself past the point of no return. And while I kept this in mind, I wanted to see where mine went. When I first got in, my body was in complete shock. I was hyperventilating and could barely control myself. All the ice was pressed up against my skin and I couldn't think about anything. But then after about a minute, I went completely numb. My skin was starting to turn red and I could feel my body temperature dropping, but still I pushed on. Between about 1 to 5 minutes in, I was so numb it actually started to feel kind of relaxing. But after that, the cold slowly started to creep back in. I managed to make it past the 10-minute mark, but by this time I was really cold. And in the end, for this ice bath, I managed to do a time of just over 15 minutes. But this is just the baseline. This is where the fun really starts. And over the course of these next 3 days, I had no idea what I was about to get myself into. Before we get into that, let's talk about my motivation for why I wanted to do this. This man that you see swimming right here is Wim Hof, and for several decades, he's been pushing people's expectations of what they're truly capable of. I've always been fascinated by what some people are able to accomplish, and I've always wondered if these people are extraordinary or if just anyone could do this. And what I find inspiring about Wim Hof is that he is just an ordinary person, and yet this ordinary person holds several world records. He's climbed Mount Kilimanjaro only wearing shorts. He hung from one finger at an altitude of 2,000 meters, swam 66 meters underneath ice, ran a half marathon barefoot in shorts in the Arctic Circle, and of course once held the world record for the longest ice bath. But he's not a superhero who is born with the ability to do all these things. He's just proved that with training, persistence, and the right techniques, all this stuff could be accomplished by an average person. Which is why I knew I needed to try this. Because all this shows that the human body is capable of a lot more than we think, and it's often our mind that holds us back. Once we could learn to get control over our mind is when all of these new opportunities open up. Is it hard? Yeah, and there were a lot of times over these next 3 days which I really wanted to give up, but I didn't. Because when you want to give up and you don't, that's what makes you strong. Wim Hof has been training for years, but I only gave myself 3 days. But with enough determination, anything is possible. So after seeing what he has done, it was officially my turn. There were several things I wanted to try over the course of the next 3 days. A lot of it was just going to be cold exposure, but there were a number of different ways in which I would accomplish this. Of course, I'd spend my own time walking around in the cold, shirtless and in only shorts. I would be taking plenty of cold showers every single day. I would of course be exercising and practicing breathing techniques to help me throughout this journey. And during this entire time, I had another challenge in mind, but I was really anxious about it. Something I've always wanted to try, but have been scared of at the same time. I wanted to try a polar plunge, which I knew would help me with cold exposure, but because of the conditions that I was in, it was much harder to do than I expected. That is one of the challenges that would happen on day 2. And all this would train me for the 3rd day, where I would attempt to stay in the ice bath for as long as I possibly could. But first, I had to start with day 1. If you don't know the information I'm about to tell you, there's a good chance it might change your life. Aside from cold walks, cold exposure, and exercise, there was one thing I really wanted to practice today. This is what's known as the Wim Hof breathing method. And if you haven't heard of it before, this exercise could literally change several things about you. You start by taking 30 breaths in. You want to focus on bringing in as much oxygen as possible and not breathing out super hard. This will help with the effects later, which I'll explain. After, you want to blow all your air out and hold. And you'll be surprised because there's so much oxygen in your body, you'll be able to hold it for longer than you thought. And when it starts to feel uncomfortable, take a deep breath in and hold again. That's the simple process that you could repeat as many times as you want. But after you feel a certain way, which you could only experience by trying, your mind clears up and you feel powerful, like you could do anything. Adrenaline is rushed through your body, and this state that you'll be in will actually help you feel warmer in the cold. And that's the technique that I would practice every single day, several times a day, and in my cold showers as well. And now that I had the foundation, it was time to move on to the first challenge. This is the part I was absolutely dreading, but I knew that once I did it, it would definitely help me feel more comfortable in the cold. What I'm about to try is what's known as a polar plunge. This is when you take a dip into a really cold body of water. This could be a lake or an ocean, but all I had access to was a heavily frozen over pond. This had ice that was up to several inches thick that I had to break through with an axe first. If you could get water as cold as possible without freezing, this was definitely it. But I had to be extremely careful when trying this because it was a fair ways back from any place warm, which means I had to be very careful to make sure that I didn't get hypothermia or frostbite. After finally managing to make a hole in the ice, this is where I realized this was going to be way harder than I thought. The air around me was freezing and the water was touching the ice. I could feel my feet going numb in the few seconds that I walked towards the hole. And at this point, I had to just let go of everything and just trust myself. I couldn't think about it. I had to just go in. By this point right here, my feet were completely numb. I was terrified because I've never done something like this before, but rather than getting out, I knew I had to go deeper. I gave myself a few minutes to hyperventilate before I was finally able to relax into it. And while this may have been the coldest I've been in my life, I told myself I couldn't get out until I put my head under. For a few moments after, I actually felt euphoric. After getting out of the water, I surprisingly didn't feel cold anymore. Feeling extremely calm, I put my clothes back on and headed back home to practice the rest of my daily routine, knowing tomorrow was the day which I'd have to attempt the real thing. The polar plunge was cold, but it was short. Now it was time to see how long I could really last. By the end of day 3, I was ready to try the real thing. This one followed the same process. For the first minute, it was absolutely horrible, but after going numb, it started to get a little better. This time though, I didn't start to feel cold again until about the 10-minute mark. But here's the problem. Once you start to feel cold, that's how you know your core body temperature is dropping, which is not a good sign. After this, I spent hours in a warmer environment trying to warm myself up. My hands and feet went numb and turned white because of the lack of circulation to them. This is not something I recommend trying on your own because it can be extremely dangerous. But I wanted to prove what the body is truly capable of if you're willing to put in a little bit of effort. The very first time I tried this, only 3 days ago, I managed to push until just over 15 minutes. And today, after pushing myself to the fullest for the past 3 days in a row, I managed to improve that time drastically. And I went from 15 minutes to over doubling it at a time of 33 minutes. I didn't break the world record, which is almost 2.5 hours. But I did show that you're capable of so much more than you think, and often all it takes is just to start.